There's something about the American housing market that doesn't quite make sense. We constantly hear that America needs more housing. But right now, there are roughly 1.5 million homes listed for sale across the country. Homes are sitting on the market longer. Sellers are cutting prices. In June, the national median asking price actually fell 2.5% from a year earlier. The largest year-over-year decline Realtor.com has recorded since it began tracking the data in 2017. And yet, millions of Americans who would like to own a home still say they can't find one they can reasonably afford. So what's going on? I think we're looking at something bigger than price. I think America has developed a housing mismatch. My name is Mark. Welcome to the Gentleman Broker Mortgage Brief. Right now, I believe we have a housing mismatch. The homes we have aren't matching the people who need them. The prices don't match incomes. The monthly payments don't match household budgets. The large homes aren't occupied by large families. The smaller homes aren't being built where people need them. And even when the right house exists, it may not exist in the right city. So today I want to look at how we got here and what could happen next. So let's start with the most obvious mismatch, price. Actually, let me correct that, payment. Because buyers don't really live in a purchase price, they live in a monthly payment. And that's an important distinction. Let's take a simple example. Imagine a $400,000 house, put 20% down, and you have a $320,000 mortgage. At a 3% interest rate, principal and interest is roughly $1,350 per month. At 6.7%, that $320,000 mortgage is roughly $2,065 per month. Same house, same purchase price, same down payment, about $700 more every single month before we've even talked about taxes, homeowners insurance, or HOA. That's roughly $8,500 more per year. And this week, Freddie Mac's average 30-year fixed rate is around 6.69%. So when someone says, people just don't want to buy houses anymore, I don't think that's necessarily true. A lot of people would love to buy. They just don't want or can't afford to make the payment that today's combination of price and interest rate creates. And we're starting to see sellers recognize that. Realtor.com reported that the median asking price nationally was $430,000 in June, down 2.5% from the year before. Almost 19% of listings had already received a price cut. And the interesting part is where those cuts are happening. In Denver, roughly 29% of listings had a price reduction. Phoenix was about 29%. Austin was nearly 28%. Meanwhile, Hartford, New York, and Buffalo were dramatically lower. So already there isn't really one American housing market. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of housing markets behaving differently all at the same time. And that brings us to the second mismatch. Think about the phrase starter home and what it used to mean. It wasn't necessarily your dream house. It might have been a 1,000 or maybe a 1,200 square foot, 2-bed, 1-bath, maybe a small garage, maybe no garage. You bought it knowing you'd probably move eventually. It was the first rung on the ladder. And somewhere along the way, that first rung became increasingly difficult to build. Today, the median newly built single-family home is still more than 2,100 square feet. Builders have actually been making homes smaller over the last decade because affordability has become such a problem. The median new home size has fallen from roughly 2,300 square feet several years ago to now 2,150 square feet in 2025. Lots are getting smaller too. Nearly 2/3 of new detached homes are now being built on lots smaller than 1/5 of an acre. Builders clearly understand that buyers need something less expensive. So why don't they just build a bunch of $250,000 starter homes? Because shrinking the house doesn't shrink every cost associated with the build. You still need the land. You still need roads, water, sewer, power, permits, inspections, financing, labor, and equipment, and all the regulatory requirements. The National Association of Home Builders released a study this summer estimating that government regulations at the federal, state, and local level now account for roughly $132,000 of an average new single-family home. According to their analysis, that's about 26% of the final sales price. Now, that's an industry estimate, and there are legitimate debates over exactly how regulatory costs should be calculated. But the larger point isn't particularly controversial. There are substantial fixed costs involved in producing a house, which creates a strange economic incentive. If you're a builder and the land, infrastructure, financing, and permitting are already expensive, building a somewhat larger or more expensive home may generate a better return than building the inexpensive starter home that the market desperately wants. And builders are clearly feeling the affordability pressure. Earlier this year, about 2/3 of builders were using sales incentives, and more than 1/3 were cutting prices. Think about that. Builders have houses. Buyers want houses. Builders are offering incentives to sell the houses, and buyers are still struggling to make the numbers work. That is a mismatch. Now we get to what I think is one of the most fascinating statistics in the entire story. Redfin recently analyzed census data that looked at America's larger homes, homes with at least 3 bedrooms. They found that empty nest baby boomers own 28% of America's 3-bedroom plus homes. Millennial families with children, they own just 16%. Let's read that another way. Empty nest boomers own almost twice as many large homes as millennials raising children. And that pattern exists in every major metro that Redfin analyzed. Now, I want to be careful because I don't like the argument that older Americans should somehow be expected to give up their homes. They bought them, they've raised their children there, their friends are nearby, their doctors are there, their memories are all there. It's their home. But from a housing market standpoint, it creates an interesting problem. Imagine a 70-year-old couple living in a 4-bedroom house they've owned for 25 years. Across town is a 35-year-old couple with 2 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment desperately trying to buy a 3 or a 4-bedroom house. On paper, the solution looks obvious. The older couple downsizes, the younger family moves up. Except, where exactly does that older couple go? A smaller new house might cost almost as much as their existing house. A condo may have a $500 a month HOA. The ranch-style 1-story home they actually want may be extremely difficult to find. And if they still have a mortgage, they may be giving up an interest rate in the 3s for one in the 6s. Suddenly, downsizing doesn't look attractive. So the 4-bedroom house stays occupied by 2 people, and the family that actually needs 4 bedrooms keeps searching. That isn't necessarily a housing shortage, that's a housing allocation problem. Hey friends, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me. I'd really appreciate the support. And this brings us to mortgage rates, because one of the strangest consequences of the pandemic housing market is that America accidentally created millions of incredibly valuable mortgages. Not houses, mortgages. As of the first quarter of this year, almost half of all outstanding mortgages, 49.9%, still had interest rates of 4% or lower. Almost 1 in 5 were at 3% or lower. And nearly 4 out of 5 existing mortgages were below 6%. That mortgage has economic value. If you owe $300,000 at 3% and moving means borrowing $400,000 at 6.5 or 7%, you're not simply deciding whether you like another house better. You're deciding whether that other house is worth giving up one of the cheapest sources of long-term debt you may ever have in your lifetime. That's why people call it the lock-in effect or the golden handcuffs. And there's a great example of how people actually think about this. In a recent survey of homeowners with mortgage rates below 4%, nearly 29% said their current home is essentially their forever home. Another 16% said they don't plan to move within the next decade. About 1/3 said a major decline in mortgage rates would be the thing most likely to get them to move. That's rational behavior. But multiply that rational decision by millions of households and it changes the entire housing market. The person with the starter home doesn't sell, so the first-time buyer can't buy it. The person with the family home doesn't downsize, so the move-up buyer can't buy it, and the entire housing ladder gets sticky. It's not completely frozen. People still get married, they get divorced, they have children, they change jobs, they retire, they move closer to family. Life eventually beats the mortgage rate, but it happens much more slowly. Now add demographics. Baby boomers have an extraordinarily high rate of home ownership. About 80% of boomers own their homes. For millennials, it's roughly 55%. And Americans over age 70 now control about 26% of all US residential real estate wealth. That's approximately 1/4 of roughly 48 trillion in residential real estate wealth. 20 years ago, the 70 plus population controlled only about 17%. So over time, America's housing wealth has become increasingly concentrated among older homeowners. Again, that isn't a criticism. It's largely what we'd expect. People acquire assets throughout their working lives. They pay down their mortgages, their homes appreciate. By retirement, many have substantial equity. But now we're approaching something that the housing market hasn't really experienced at this scale before. Eventually, those homes and that equity have to go somewhere. You've probably heard the phrase, the great wealth transfer. There are estimates that approximately $124 trillion of wealth will transfer through 2048. About $105 trillion is expected to go to heirs, and nearly $100 trillion is expected to come from baby boomers and generations older than them. Millennials alone are projected to inherit around $46 trillion over the next 25 years. But here's where I think the housing conversation gets interesting. We normally talk about inheritance as money, IRAs, investments, stocks, but a huge amount of older Americans' wealth is sitting inside their homes, and homes are different. You can't divide a 3-bedroom ranch into 3 brokerage accounts. Eventually, someone has to decide what happens to it. Do the siblings sell it? Does one sibling buy out the other? Does it become a rental? Does the family keep it as a second home? Does the equity become the down payment on another house? Nobody knows exactly how that plays out at scale. And there's been a lot of talk about the coming silver tsunami where boomers suddenly sell millions of houses and flood the market. Freddie Mac studied this. Their conclusion was basically, don't expect a tsunami, expect a tide. In 2022, there were roughly 32 million boomer homeowner households. Freddie Mac estimates that number could gradually decline to around 23 million by 2035 as boomers age. That's significant, 9 million fewer boomer homeowner households. But it happens over more than a decade. So instead of millions of houses suddenly appearing for sale one Tuesday morning, we're likely looking at a slow generational reshuffling of American housing. And that reshuffling could be one of the biggest housing stories of the next 10 or 20 years. There's one more piece of the mismatch I think we still haven't fully processed. And it comes from what happened during COVID. Because the housing market didn't just move slowly over the last 5 years, it whiplashed. When the pandemic hit, something very unusual happened in real estate. Remote work suddenly became normal, and people realized something very quickly. If you don't have to go into the office every day, you don't necessarily have to live near the office anymore. And that triggered one of the fastest housing migrations in modern history. People left expensive coastal cities, they left dense urban cores, and they moved into what you call lifestyle markets. Places like Utah, Idaho, Arizona, Tennessee, smaller towns in Texas and Florida, even secondary suburbs that had never seen that level of demand before. And it wasn't gradual, it was fast. In some cases, it was a flood. Small towns that were never designed for that level of inbound demand suddenly saw bidding wars, cash offers, and double-digit price increases. Homes that had been sitting on the market for years were suddenly gone in days, and builders reacted exactly how you would expect. They followed the demand. They moved into those high-growth areas and started building aggressively because that's what the market was demanding. That's what they were signaling. This is where people are going. At the same time, major cities like San Francisco, Seattle, and parts of New York saw something very different. They didn't just slow down. In some cases, they were effectively vacuumed out. Demand softened, renters left, buyers left, and inventory loosened. So you had this strange split. Small towns overheating, big cities cooling, builders chasing the hot markets, and capital flowing into places that had never seen that kind of growth before. But here's the part that matters for today. That entire system is now reversing because the world that created that migration is not the world we're in anymore. Remote work is still here, but it's far less universal. Major corporations are increasingly pushing return to office policies. Hybrid is becoming more structured. Fully remote roles are shrinking in many industries. And that changes everything because the original migration was built on one assumption: you can live anywhere. But the new reality is shifting back towards you need to be somewhere. And as that happens, the housing market is now dealing with the second order effects of the COVID migration. The small towns and secondary markets that absorbed massive demand are now seeing that demand normalized, or in some cases, softened. Meanwhile, the major cities that were left behind are now seeing renewed pressure. People are returning, jobs are pulling people back, and population flows are rebalancing. But housing supply doesn't adjust that quickly. So you get a lag. Builders built into the boom markets, but now the tide is shifting back towards the large metros. And those markets are once again tightening. Not because there aren't enough homes in America, but because the homes are in the wrong place at the wrong time relative to where people are moving right now. So you get this layered effect. COVID pulled people out of cities, remote work enabled geographic dispersion, builders followed that demand outward. Now work is pulling people back inward, but supply is still catching up to the old demand map, and that's the key point. The housing market isn't just mismatched in price or size, it's mismatched in time. Supply is reacting to yesterday's migration. Demand is shifting based on today's work reality. And the result is friction everywhere. And when you layer that COVID migration cycle on top of everything else, it becomes even clearer that there isn't really one housing market in America. We say the housing market as if it's one thing. It isn't. Look at June nationally. About 19% of listings received price cuts, but in Denver, it was 29%, Phoenix, 29%, Austin, 28%. Meanwhile, Hartford was about 7%, New York was about 9%, Buffalo was around 10%. LA recently had active inventory actually decline year over year, even while national inventory increased. So you kind of have this buyer's market in one part of America and a seller's market somewhere else. You can have builders offering enormous incentives in one zip code while buyers compete for a 60-year-old house 20 miles away. You can have houses sitting for months in one state and multiple offers in another. That's why national headlines can be misleading. Home prices are falling. Where? There's no inventory. Where? It's a buyer's market. Where? The answer increasingly depends on your zip code. So, do we actually have enough houses? I don't think the answer is that simple. There are legitimate measures showing undersupply, particularly in certain markets. Vacancy rates remain historically tight in parts of the country. Certain cities absolutely need more housing, and we continue creating new households. So yes, building matters. But I also don't think you can explain today's housing market simply by saying we need more houses. Because imagine we built 1 million additional homes. What if they're mostly $700,000 homes when buyers need $350,000 homes? What if they're built 60 miles away from where the jobs are? What if they're two-story houses when the people trying to downsize need one-story homes? What if they're luxury apartments when families want three-bedroom homes? What if the monthly payment still requires 45% of someone's income? Technically, we created supply, but did we solve the problem? That's the great American housing mismatch. We have houses. We have people who want the houses. We have older homeowners with enormous amounts of equity. We have younger families trying to build equity. We have builders who want to sell houses. We have sellers who want to sell houses. We have buyers who want to buy houses. But the pieces aren't lining up. The price doesn't match the income. The payment doesn't match the price. The house doesn't match the household. The existing homeowner doesn't have somewhere attractive to move. The starter home isn't economical enough to build, and sometimes the affordable house simply isn't where the buyer needs to live. What happens next? I think there are several things worth watching. Builders are already responding with smaller houses, smaller lots, townhomes, and incentives. Sellers are becoming more realistic about prices. Mortgage lock-in will gradually weaken, not because everyone suddenly decides a 3% mortgage isn't valuable, but because life keeps happening. Boomer-owned housing will gradually transfer. Some will be sold, some will be inherited. What buyers should be doing is being intentional about where they want to live and what lifestyle they need. When it makes sense to own a home, negotiate the price to a reasonable amount and look towards seller credits to buy down rate or help with closing costs. What realtors should be doing is evaluating their market and understanding where people are migrating from and where they are leaving to. America's housing market is always built for yesterday's families, yesterday's jobs, and yesterday's economics. To be successful as a buyer, seller, or agent, spend more time predicting human geographical patterns rather than the bond markets. This has been your mortgage brief for the week. With that, I will leave you with this quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson. A house is made with walls and beams. A home is built with love and dreams. For everyone watching, I hope you continue to find opportunities to learn and grow so that you can create better outcomes for yourself and for the people who have trusted you to serve them. My name is Mark, and I am the Gentleman Broker.